Hey everybody, lately I've been thinking about the state of the world and our society here in America in general. And yesterday I was actually on a TV shoot and I had an opportunity to speak with a few women, and we basically conversed about, society and the state that we're in and how our children are being educated and what's happening with them and what's happening to people in society in general. If you'll excuse me, I have a little bit of a frog in my throat, a little sore throat. But it's interesting, it led me to write an essay on, well, let me just read it to you. The title is The Power of Choice and Self-Determinism in Education and Society. What is man's actual worth in society? Man meaning an individual person. What role does he play? What determines that role? What conditions dictate if he is to wear a black hat or a white hat? When a child is 3 or 4 years old, it's unimaginable that he should tell his mother, "Mom, I want to be a murderer when I grow up and be in prison till I die." He's more likely to say, "I want to be a fireman or a police officer, a teacher, a doctor, or the president." In other words, he wants to play the part of a hero. He wants to grow up and be the person people look up to. He wants to give life to the ideal society. He doesn't even know, or perhaps he does, that the society needs its heroes, but he already knows he wants to be one. A good parent will accept and understand his child's aspirations and not mute, belittle, or dissuade him from goals of a better life for himself and others. When a parent does not, I can imagine a terrible cycle is beginning all over again. A child soon discovers his worth when his ideas are accepted or they are destroyed. Many times children are fed ideas, more often than not, of a society, Many times children are fed ideas, more often than not, of a socially acceptable nature, or on the opposite end, an antisocial nature, when in reality he has a great imagination and only needs to be nourished and allowed the opportunity to choose and to exercise self-determinism in his positive goals and dreams. This is where education plays a key role. It has the power to create and destroy a child. Education is also forced on a child from preschool or kindergarten through high school, and if they make it through college, the child, now a student, is also fed ideas. Being educated, in essence, has become reading the ideas and stories of philosophers and historians who may never have had actual experience, but instead were just students of history and philosophy themselves. So the education that a student receives is not from the source, i.e., reading texts by Socrates or by historical figures, but rather arranged by historians who've read what other historians have written, and those historians in turn have read from others, and so on and so forth. By this time, our education has gone through a telephone game of major proportions. This is the first problem with education. No true source, except perhaps for mathematics. The second problem is part of the first, feeding a child. Feeding a child when he is not hungry makes him abhor food. Thus it is with education. I myself was never interested in learning about sewing and thus never took a home economics class. I learned to cook through observation and trial and error, and I learned to be a mother just by being one. On the other hand, there were classes forced upon me, like chemistry, which I don't have any interest in at all. That's true. So I am averse to chemistry. Force a child to study something he doesn't want to study and watch him fail, unless by looking at it, he discovers he has some interest. Offering something that one can look at, observe, and make a self-led choice is the answer to the question of interest. Self-discovery comes by observation and decision. If a parent offers the child to learn how to cook, the child is not interested, the matter should be closed, unless the child changes his mind at a later date. Then the interest should be taken up and satisfied. In school, students are constantly inundated with education that they don't want or need. Some students fulfill the duties like good little boys and girls, and some students do not. Those students are usually mislabeled as stupid, ADD, ADHD, problem children, or other not my problem, his problem excuses from the teachers as to why the student wouldn't learn. No one asked the child, "Do you want to learn this?" No one asked the child, "What are you interested in?" Once the child is no longer a child of ages 3 to 11, let's say, people cease asking the child, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Instead, they're led around and forced to look at and choose things that may not be important to them. By then, the dream of being a hero is long gone, and the reality that the parents require them to go to work and earn a good living is implanted in their heads. When will the student be allowed to choose? It is at this point that we approach a crossroads in the young man or woman's life. No longer a child, he is faced with the reality that he is being required to do something. Perhaps he's been labeled by other students, teachers, or his parents a troubled or problem child. Now this plays a role in his perceived worth to himself and to society. People wonder why young men and women join gangs in junior high, and if they make it in high school. The above is the answer. Their worth to society has already been determined, but not by them. By thoroughly educating a person by force feeding, he is stripped away of his self-determinism. He no longer chooses his interests. Thus, he may decide to drop out of school. When he does this, he seeks other ways of educating himself, so he can exercise self-determinism. Perhaps a gang says to him, "You can have anything you want." Perhaps they say to him, "We are the only ones who care about you." Perhaps this new forced feeding seems like an answer. So he immediately has interest and chooses to educate himself to this new way of thinking and behaving. He determines that if society thinks his worth is this, then I'll show them. Then he is lost. Prison will be his next level of education, if he even lives long enough to make it behind bars. Now, prison is interesting. Prison began as a penitentiary. It comes from the word penitent, which means feeling or expressing humble or regretful pain or sorrow for sins or offenses. It's also a noun, which means a person who repents of sin, or a person under church censure, but admitted to penance or reconciliation, especially under the direction of a confessor. So the penitentiary system was meant as a place to repent, a place to seek God or a higher understanding, and perhaps make amends for a person's past transgressions. Now prisons are forms of punishment. One could argue that punishment works, but if it does, I have not seen it. Not well, if at all. Thus we get the vicious cycle of the revolving door. The rare opportunity to educate oneself in prison seems the only solution. What is a prisoner's worth to society compared to his actual worth? Society has already deemed him a menace, and if he gets paroled from prison without an education that he chooses, his only option may be to do the same things that got him into trouble in the first place. Because he's decided that society was right, his actual worth to himself is likely zero, because society sees him as a zero. Once a child wanting to be a hero, he is now a prisoner and a zero. But that's a lie spread only by his uncertain future and society's misconduct and misunderstanding of him from the very beginning, which served to mold him into the man he is today. For if he were educated, even now in this late stage, I should say, if he were allowed the opportunity to seek out a new education, a positive education, instead of the inmate to inmate education that most get these days, when he is released from prison, he will have significant worth to himself because he can now earn a living without stealing, robbing, or hurting others. His worth to society will be improved because he's educated himself in law, medicine, business, education, whatever his own decisions have determined. And now his worth to himself is a lot higher. He shall be on a new plane of existence, and that's what makes him rehabilitated. His discovery that his worth is not zero. His discovery that he can do something for mankind that has value, and he can do something for himself that has value. So now the man becomes the child once again, invigorated with the new discovery, a self-discovery. I can be myself. I can choose myself. I have self-determinism. I have worth. I can do something for man. This is how he should have grown up. Let's go back to him as a child. Now give him self-determinism, then power of choice, then feed his interests, validate him for wanting to help, for wanting to create, for wanting to do something valuable to society, and teach him that he can have these things. All he need do is educate himself and use his own power-ups of observation to make the right choices, and he can have and do anything. This child will grow up to be a hero. So that's my essay. I mean, I could go into, the ideals of parenting as well, setting a good example for your children, but I think just by the sheer words of the essay, you can kind of interpret that as this is all very important, and I think that if we can give ourselves this, the idea of the power of choice and self-determinism, and recognize when we're being force-fed the BS that a lot of times we're force-fed, and that we don't force-feed our children the BS as well, that we actually allow them to grow up and to use their own choices and power of self-determinism and their own interest, and to validate when they're interested in something. When they're interested, they have goals, and to validate that and help that grow. Then we'll be doing something not only for ourselves and for our children, but for society in general, because we create a better society when our children are raised properly and raised with the idea in mind that they can do something, So, anyway, my philosophy for today